forging powerful alliances among people of diverse faiths and beliefs, building a resilient, inclusive democracy, helping America fulfill its promise of religious freedom and civil rights, not just for some, but for all. This is the heart of Interfaith Alliance.
No hate in my faith. No hate in my faith.
For 3 decades, Interfaith Alliance has been boldly combating religious extremism, safeguarding our democracy, and fighting for clear boundaries between religion and government, so that every American has the opportunity to thrive. From our local grassroots affiliates to policy change in Washington, D.C., our history is marked by impactful action. Throughout, we've fought the rise of Christian nationalism.
Christian nationalists are attempting to rewrite our history,
which has fueled book bans, LGBTQIA+ discrimination, reproductive freedom attacks, voting rights issues, and the surge in anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry, and other forms of hate.
You want to ban somebody? Come and get me, you son of a bitch.
But we're not just fighting against something. We're fighting for something. A vision of America where people from different faiths and beliefs come together, creating an inclusive democracy that's strong and welcoming for everyone. An America that truly embodies religious freedom and the rights of all its people, no matter who they are, who they love, and how or if they pray. This vision for a better world is not just a hope, it's a call to action. For 30 years, Interfaith Alliance has been forging powerful alliances across diverse faiths and beliefs, committed to fulfilling America's promise of religious freedom and civil rights for everyone. Now, as we step into the next chapter, we need your voice, your inspiration, and your action to turn this dream into our shared reality and continue achieving democracy together.
Join us. Together we will be powerful. Together we will meet this global crisis of authoritarianism. Together we will be guided by love. Together we will win.
Interfaith Alliance, achieving democracy together.
A reading from 1 Corinthians 13 through 1 through 13. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but do not possess love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I might boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, but then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. So let me say how thankful I am to be back in this beautiful building this Unitarian church. I want to thank the leadership of this church, as well as Naomi and so many others who made it possible for me to come. I have many friends here. Tom, it means a lot to me that you came today. Tom was an old friend from Chatham, and it's remarkable for me to see him here. Jamie and Stefania, thank you so much for all of your spiritual, emotional, and support of my organization. My sisters, Carla and Lorraine, my father, Walter, my good friend, Deborah, and of course, I have to mention my two boys who are going to behave so well over the last little time, right? So anyway, I am delighted to have Glenn and Walter here, and much of what I do in the world today is dedicated to them. So this morning's talk is titled, Shall Christian Nationalists Win? The Critical Role of Congregations in Protecting Our Diverse Democracy. I want to focus on the power that we have in our spiritual and religious communities that is absolutely crucial for meeting the current moment. The title of my talk is a reference to a sermon preached by Harry Emerson Fosdick in 1922 at First Presbyterian Church in New York City called Shall the Fundamentalists Win? It was one of the most famous sermons of the early 20th century. Fosdick's words have been much cited by liberal Christians over the past 100 years, concerned that their faith is being distorted by other Christians who are rigidly fixated on scriptural inerrancy, riven with apocalyptic worldviews, and intolerant of dissent. Reverend Fosdick was kicked out of his church for preaching that sermon. Hopefully, I will not experience a similar fate today. However, the serious religious and theological concerns that Fosdick addressed in the 1920s, the sermon only hints at the adverse effect that Christian fundamentalism had on society in the early 20th centuries and continues decades later to this day. A century later, we are faced with an even more serious threat, one that takes the theological language of Christian fundamentalism and grafts it onto a ruthless political machine, intent on using the power of the state to enforce its worldview on the entire society. As some of you may not have been here on the July 5th when I first spoke, it's helpful to take a few minutes to share just some of the defining features of Christian nationalism, which is an ideology, a quest for power, and a lens through which a growing number of Americans view their role in our society. It is not new, but it has drawn recent mainstream attention after Christian symbols, flags, and Bible verses were ubiquitous during the violent attacks on the Capitol on January 6th. Christian nationalism has its roots in the dangerous myth that we were founded as a Christian nation and that Christianity holds a privileged place in our nation that must be preserved. They use the rhetoric of a Christian nation with its underpinnings of white supremacy, xenophobia, patriarchy, and authoritarianism to dictate who is a true American and who will be relegated to perennial outside status. The goal of Christian nationalism is the consolidation of power in the hands of a few, of an exclusive religious and political movement, and it is using churches, the courts, and increasingly electoral politics to gain power over the majority of the American people. The goal of Christian nationalism is the establishment of a theocracy. Unfortunately, Christian nationalism is not relegated to the shadowed corners of our country. A poll recently released by Public Religion Research Institute and Brookings Institute that indicates that close to 30% of Americans are either adherents or sympathetic to Christian nationalism, and that among white evangelical Protestant, that number jumps to nearly 2/3. Over 1 in 4 Americans believe that the United States should declare itself a Christian nation. As journalist and author Catherine Stewart recently wrote in the New Republic, Christian nationalists are increasingly framing their efforts as a spiritual battle that resonates with many of its followers from more charismatic and Pentecostal traditions. Christian nationalism pits the power of Jesus, which is their side, versus the power of Satan, which is anyone who opposes them. The spiritualization of political power introduces a zero-sum game in which compromise is capitulation and in which nothing less than God's favor is at stake, stakes that lead to violence. And violence is acceptable in the Christian nationalist worldview, who approve of using violence for their goals at 7 times the rate of other Americans. Nearly 1 in 5 Americans assert not only that the United States is a white Christian nation, but also that they are willing to fight to preserve it. If you are alarmed, then you are paying attention, because we should be alarmed. But that does not mean we should lose hope. It does, however, mean that we need to get busy. The good news is, as of now, Christian nationalism continues to be unpopular. 70% of Americans reject the call to declare America a Christian nation. Close to 75% of Americans say they prefer a country made up of diverse faiths and not just Christianity. 80% of Americans reject the idea that Christians should exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Christian nationalist views on race, gender, immigration, and LGBTQ people are also unpopular and out of step with the American public. We are in a crucial moment, and it will take all of us to counteract the influence of Christian nationalist ideology and defend our democracy. Spiritual and religious congregations like this one will play a critical role because of the power you have. Now, before I get to the role of congregations, I want to tell you a foundational story about my own spiritual development. I was raised in a Presbyterian church in Madison, Wisconsin, where we went to church on Sundays, and it was expected of us around the age of 15 or 16 when we went to go through confirmation classes and decide whether or not we were going to join the church. I believe I'm the only person in the history of the Presbyterian Church to fail confirmation because I didn't know that attendance of the classes was mandatory. Instead, I went for an hour or so to play with my friends, came back at around approximately the appropriate time, and then the day before I showed up to the confirmation, ready to, receive all the glory, and the pastor said, "Almost all of you will be confirmed." And he looked at me out of the corner of my eyes, and I was like, who's not getting confirmed? Anyway, turns out it was me. But it did teach me one of the most important lessons of my spiritual life, that it mattered that I showed up. It mattered where I put my body, where I put my energy, and that I showed up with others for what I believed in my community. And right now, in this pivotal moment in our nation's history, it matters that we as individuals, but also that we as faith and spiritual communities show up and stand up against Christian nationalism. In this moment when civic spaces where people have traditionally congregated, like public schools, higher education, and libraries, are being hollowed out and under attack, the physical campuses that house spiritual and religious congregations can serve as welcoming locations where people can continue to come together and find common ground and common purpose. Isolation and separation are the enemies of democracy. But when we come together and we grow in trust and understanding, we build a powerful inoculation against the culture of demonization and distrust in which Christian nationalism thrives. Many congregations are already playing this role, and it would be powerful to see an interconnected map of the Cape and Islands with dozens and maybe hundreds of spiritual and religious communities that are destinations where diverse civic life is valued and people from every background are invited to physically come together and know one another. In addition to locations where we can draw people in, congregations have networks to send people out for rapid mobilization and response. Congregations are people, and people are power. If a local temple, mosque, or other community has been targeted with bigotry or violence, as is increasingly the case, congregations like this one can bring out people to show up and to offer solidarity and support. In addition to moments of crisis, congregations have the power to mobilize a diverse group of religious and spiritual people from a range of traditions to show up side by side at public forums, community rallies, to the voting booth, sending clear signals to our elected officials and our neighbors that we reject the exclusive claims of Christian nationalism and demand that this community be a place where people of all faiths and all backgrounds be treated equally under the law. Congregations can also provide a hub for reliable information sharing and education. Knowledge is power, and congregations are places of learning about spiritual traditions and practices, but also about the world around us. Reading books together, watching films, educating ourselves about our country's actual history and the experience of diverse Americans in an environment of open inquiry is more important now than ever, that there is so much disinformation. As we know, Christian nationalists are attempting to erase our history with book bans, rewriting of history curriculums, and we need to mobilize to reverse those efforts. But in the meantime, the learning can go on inside of our congregations. I talked to one pastor in Florida who is organizing an accredited African-American AP course in his church, for which the students will receive credit now that the actual course is no longer offered in the Florida system. In a congregation I had with the public theologian Diana Buckler Bass, she suggested that every congregation should look at the banned book list in their local community and invest in buying those books for their congregation's library. And as I was writing this sermon, a seminary classmate of mine posted that she was just then reading from her church's banned book brunch selection. This is tragic that we've come to this. But it does call upon the great part of the religious tradition in America where congregations have been places of resistance, as well as locations where truth is protected and shared. Perhaps the greatest the contribution of congregations to this effort will not be what, but will be how we approach the struggle against Christian nationalists. I confess to you that Christian nationalism and the people who are its followers really frighten and anger me. And I find my hand balling into a fist as I prepare for the battle ahead. We are in a dangerous situation and we need to be heads up about the threat. However, it is worth considering how we shall engage this struggle without becoming what we hate. This is perhaps the most important role that congregations can play in this current moment. We heard the reading from 1 Corinthians about love. This reading is recognizable to many of us from weddings, but it was not actually about the love between two people. It was written to an early Christian church in Corinth that was divided by issues of class, gender, and background, plus different ways to practice their faith. Earlier in the letter, Paul attempts to persuade the church how much they need one another and that the diversity within their church is part of their strength. And in this passage, he acknowledges that there are many ways for followers of Jesus to practice their faith, but there is one characteristic that is the most important, and that is love. One more confession. When I hear about love, when I feel angry and threatened, as I do about Christian nationalism, it's hard for me to contain the eye roll. I mean, love, come on. However, when I look to the spiritual leaders whom I admire the most, they talk about love. Gandhi said, "The nectar of love alone can destroy the poison of hate." And Gandhi's student, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., told us, "Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great of a burden to bear." And Nelson Mandela said, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than the opposite." The challenge Christian nationalism poses to our country is grave, but certainly no graver than what Dr. King, Mahatma Gandhi, or Nelson Mandela faced. They chose love because they looked into the deep well of their spiritual tradition and saw the path of love offered the greatest resource and tactic that would actually lead to the future they longed for. The opportunity for us is to do the same. It starts in a way that's very personal. And the local congregation can help each one of us learn how to access the love in our spirits, hearts, and minds. How do we learn the discipline of love? Because it is hard to learn and requires practice. But as so many of our spiritual forebears remind us, it can and must be done. Each diverse congregation will call upon its own wisdom, which is the beauty of it. We can learn from one another's traditions of love as sources of the ultimate power. We can also learn the collective practice of love that is nonviolent resistance. In a conversation I had with Representative John Lewis before he died about his time in the civil rights movement, he told me that people had to be trained in nonviolence before they were even allowed to show up at protests. Our congregations can be a place where we learn the deep roots of nonviolent protest and show up with love, even as we resist the powers that would demean or destroy us. Congregations can also bring the banner of love into our wider community and our democracy. Justice is what love looks like in public, and we can bring that justice love with us as we raise the banner of love in our democracy. Love will be our guide, our tactic, and our power as our congregations mobilize in this time of great challenge to our democracy. In my tradition, we believe that love is more powerful than hate and that love overcomes fear. This is not just about them out there, but about us. When we are overcome by love, we uncurl the fist and extend the hand. And we show up filled with the hope that inspires us to sing, "Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome Christian nationalism in our day." Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Paul. We've come to the time.
Good. Thank you for, so this is really just an open discussion time, and I have some microphones here. If Dan can help. If anybody wants to comment. I had some, first of all, what did you think? I thought it was such a hopeful, positive message. I just really wanted to bring it to our church. Well, I have a few topics up here. Who's been thinking about this? Are we a Christian nation? And what?
We are not. We never have been.
Oh, Judith.
I am so glad to know that this is a movement. I have been so concerned about what is called Christian nationalism, and have felt so powerless about it that I'm just so grateful, and I thank you for this information.
He crystallized it for me when he said, basically, the U.S. is not about being a theocracy. It just boils down to that one.
Yeah, and I might add that you can see why this and democracy are at odds in this election, because you have a very strong group of people who are espousing a minority position. And so you can talk all day about how, well, the majority of Americans don't agree with them. Well, that matters as long as we have a democracy, but it's a mindset that says if we have to get rid of democracy because we want this minority position to be the ruling position, then that's kind of where we're at right now.
And now that we've learned that we only have to vote one more time and then it'll all be taken care of, that's quite frightening.
I was just going to say it's ridiculous to think whites only, English speakers only, Christians only. I've been teaching second language learners kids from the 80s and watched as the influx of different countries. That was a time of Vietnamese people coming over, and then there's just each time there's war-torn countries, those are the kids that you find in your schools. And I can't even, it's just the most ridiculous thing to think that anybody actually believes that. Maybe they hope because they've lost their way, they hope it's all going to be just about them. But boy, oh boy, there's as many religions as you can name.
Sure, okay. Yeah, no, I'm really glad we're talking about this too. I just want to say, I think having grown up inside Christian nationalism, and then we just spent the last 2 weeks deep in South Dakota, Montana, which is kind of heart of this. I think we underestimate it at our peril, really. So I'm glad we're having these conversations, and we may, depending on, who knows, have to be more of a resistance than we are used to being.
What have you heard from the inside recently then?
Well, I think that when I'm home here, it's easy to forget how prevalent and homogenous this view is in other parts of the country. I went to a very small UCC church in South Dakota that my friend pastors, but it's by far the minority. You know, most of the churches and the faith and people just assume that you have this kind of Christianity in South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, all those other red states.
How do those people survive in those small churches?
Well, that's what I wonder, if we're going to have to learn, to be. I hope not. But, the resistance, they develop networks with each other, really, but very small networks.
I'm going to get to you, Alice, but just to pick up on that, I just heard a comment from, I don't remember the context, but it was about more liberal people surviving and thriving in red America. And when you're deep in that, what do you do? And the person was saying that actually, for all that we want to criticize the internet and social media and everything, one of the strengths of it is it has allowed, shall we say, blue voices in red places to connect with one another and strengthen. And there are becoming to be some very prominent voices of progressive people from Kansas and Tennessee and all over the place. So Alice has been waiting.
Well, I've been reading and following the right ever since Trump was elected, just to try to understand them. And one thing that they say is the United States was founded on Judeo-Christian values in order to kind of get around this, the term Christian nationalism. And why do we want all these people who weren't raised with Judeo-Christian values? That's how the U.S. was founded, and we have to keep that up in the U.S.
I was really intrigued by the idea of the Florida congregation that's teaching an AP African American Studies class for credit in Florida where it's been banned. And I was wondering, and also thinking about the Ten Commandments being required to be posted in every classroom in Louisiana and the Bible to be taught in every public school classroom, well, I guess 5th grade and up in Oklahoma. We have less of that I'm aware of, at least here, but what can we do locally to support these things and make sure we don't end up having to be the small blue voice in a red state?
I have a comment from Zoom on Deb Marinos. Thank you for being here, by the way. She says, I was happy to hear the way is to educate and that showing love is powerful, because often when you start fighting with this group only makes, because often when you start fighting with this group only makes this narrow and minority message more prominent. And I think Katie has a comment now. Thank you, Deb.
Well, I just had one thing to let you know about, because it's coming up. It will be eventually. A Family Life Committee has started a few people being trained in, if you want to look it up, it's the UU and UCC Church put together Our Whole Lives, which is a sexuality education for youth. We're going to do middle and high school. But we just started learning about it, and they said this is explicitly political because it is accepting of gender expressions, all sexualities, etc. And I know that currently in Oregon, that's not unusual, but in many other states and possibly federally in the future, who knows, it could be subversive, in a way. So that is one thing that you can kind of keep your ears out for if you know youth that need good, because one of the tenets of that type of Christianity is that you don't get good sexuality education, of course. And so that's one thing that's coming up that we could be a hub for, at least in my mind.
In answer to Scott's question, how do those little churches survive? I grew up in them, and then my son and both my brother are members of those kinds of churches, and they choose somebody stands up and says, I'll preach, and they feed each other's, they meet in free places, and they feed each other's prejudices, and they are isolated. And if you dare to, I've been slapped for daring to challenge beliefs. So it's passing the buck around. I'll be preacher today and you'll be preacher tomorrow kind of thing, and isolating.
I also want to say that it would be worthwhile I have it on. It would be worthwhile to have a real investigation here at church about the response to we were founded as a Christian nation, because we actually were not founded as a Christian nation. One of the, the First Amendment is about freedom of religion and freedom from religion. And there's some good resources on that Interfaith Alliance website. And also there's, other resources that go into the history and show how we were really founded and also why that's so powerful, why it's so important, just, for the religions as well as for people who are not religious, that our justice system, that our public, who we are publicly, and justice is equal. And it's not more, you don't get more rights if you're Christian. And the Christian nationalists are explicitly coming up with ideas to give more rights to Christians, to
women that have children,
to men, to women who have children, according to their belief system, but to shape our country in such a way that it is going to be unequal justice. But it's very important to know that our Constitution is not founded on that, and that is not accurate, and to get more information about that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that one some more next week, because the book we're going to look at next week, Brandon Scott makes the specific claim that there were a lot of philosophical streams around when our country was founded, and some of them were Christian. There's just been a big Great Awakening, and lots of fervent religiosity out there, but the Constitution is a child of the Enlightenment, yes, which is very important to keep in mind, because once you start trying to apply fundamentalist principles to an Enlightenment document, you've got it all wrong. And so if you're interpreting the Constitution so that it gives rights and it implies other rights, and you're finding new rights that the Constitution provides, then you're following the Enlightenment, and you're probably on the right track. If you're looking at the Constitution and saying, oh, no, you only have the rights that you had in 1776 or whatever, and trying to ignore history and the opening or the expansion of rights, then you're totally on the wrong track. And that's kind of what we have right now, is constitutional fundamentalism.
Jean, they're bringing you a mic.
I'll beg your pardon first. I'm on some medications which cause my memory and me to become imbalanced. But a thought just came up to me when it comes to guns. And I'm concerned with the one amendment that says, please help me, which one of the...
Second Amendment.
The second one about
The
right to bear arms. And that's a little frightening to me because I believe from what I'm hearing today and what I've experienced and just knowing what's going on in our society, I just wonder if this, what's the proper terminology for the group that we're,
Christian nationalism.
Christian nationalists. I wonder if they wouldn't just, believe that they are the only ones who could bear arms.
Oh, definitely.
The thought of it just crossed my mind with that amendment pretty well threatened. I don't mean we need to save that amendment. I'm saying it should be, when you talk about the right to bear arms, that has got somehow, how can we abolish, automatic weapons and AK-15s, which are what are doing most of the killing, like in schools and such things. So it's a quandary that just came to my mind.
Yeah, I've pondered that quandary too. It's because what they're after is to destroy the Constitution in order to save the Second Amendment, right, which I think if you destroy the Constitution, the Second Amendment goes with it. I mean, just to my logical thinking, but maybe that's wrong.
Well, what I really appreciated about what Paul was saying is, you know, that congregations like ours really do have acceptable roles to play. That we don't have to just say, well, the Christian Nationalists, of course, they preach a particular perspective in their churches, and maybe they shouldn't be doing that. But as congregations with alternate views of what America and democracy is about, we have roles that we can play. It's not too political for us to take, you know, to speak about the value of a diverse democracy, to have in speakers from other faith communities to share, you know, their own perspectives, and to be a place of engagement with people with diverse viewpoints. That is a role that is perfectly within our power. And I think you do that very well, Scott, often.
Well, I just wanted to call attention to the third bullet point, wants to advantage certain people as real Americans. And we want to challenge that. We also want to challenge the idea that real Christians may or may not be those who subscribe to these Christian nationalistic views. I think making that point, we are so invisible to 95% of quote unquote Christians in this country, or maybe, I hope it's less than that. But without, you know, standing on our head or doing backflips, I hope we can get our message out in the next several months, particularly.
I wanted to speak to the book ban part. A year or maybe 2 years ago, the Mission and Social Justice Committee contacted the libraries in our area to find out if there had been challenges, and we haven't had any. So we are so lucky to live where we are.
But again, if certain things happened at a national level, things could move that would affect all of us. And that's where we can't feel too complacent here in lovely Oregon or California or any of the other states where we are not subjected to so much of this, because it doesn't take that much of a change, you know, to have that really affect us.
No, I was not saying that at all.
Right, I know.
was simply saying we were
are
looking at
lucky.
it. Did we need to buy some books for our church? And they said, everything's fine here.
I beg your pardon, I'm so concerned about my choice of words, or maybe not what I'm really thinking. Did I make it clear that I'm concerned that the folks who are claiming themselves to be Christians, that they will hold on to that amendment that says we have the right to bear arms?
Oh, yeah.
And I'm a little concerned that their powerful force and belief that arms will include AK-15s, and here we are, some people striving to make some laws and rules against which guns. Right. So it's a little bit of a clash of wills regarding that particular amendment, and it concerns me.
And we are in the majority as far as public opinion on a lot of these issues. We are part of a majority, but we do have to join hands with the diverse friends that we have within that majority in order to have our voices actually be heard.
Obviously, we need to take more of the public discourse around our thinking. Every time they talk about Christian nationalism, I cringe because I'm a Christian. That doesn't describe me, and it's really frustrating.
Well, I'm really glad that we could have this talk today, and we'll be meeting again next week to further the discussion. But thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. And
yeah, let me,
your Sunday.
I guess we'll wrap up with a couple of commercials because this is a better crowd than the full congregation to get into details on a couple of these things. I mentioned next week's class. We're going to look at a book called The Religious History of Abortion by Brandon Scott, who's one of the original Jesus Seminar people, has been doing progressive theology for years. It's a new book by him that he wrote after the Dobbs decision. And he talks about patriarchy and nationalism and ancient traditions and where does Catholic pro-life stuff come from and where does white evangelical pro-life stuff come from, which are actually two completely different things that just happen to coalesce into a movement. So it says a lot about our politics today, and it's going to be a huge issue going forward, especially now that we have a candidate for whom it's a huge issue. And so that's happening next week. Also, you know about Poverty by America, Southminster Reed's book. Working on getting somebody to come in September. We haven't quite nailed that down. But what we did do is we made sure that the September selection for the First Tuesday book group is relevant to that discussion too. And I wanted to highlight to some people that may be interested in joining the book group for that 1 month, which is, it's a book called The Color of Law, and it's kind of picks up where Poverty by America kind of doesn't go, which is the complete role, a complete discussion of the role the government has played in racial discrimination in housing and how that is such a huge contributor to the wealth gap between white and black Americans. To me, it's a really important corollary to the poverty discussion. So we're going to talk about that on the first Tuesday of September. I know that the fact that the First Tuesday book group meets at 7:30 on Tuesday nights makes it really hard for choir members, but I'm thinking that if somebody, say Julia and Diane or whoever else, maybe Sue, who is here for choir practice, that we might, at least for that one evening, just go back to room 7 or something after choir and do book group here on site so that people who are in choir can also do it. So if you need more information, just talk to me, but it's on I think is our book list on the website now?
I don't know whether it's been updated. I think it is going to be on there.
It's online if you go to southmin.org and get the full info on that, but it's a fascinating book. It's written by a lawyer who's basically spent his entire life researching housing discrimination in America. And it's a little legalistic in places, but it's a very good book, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion on that as a kind of a supplement to our poverty discussion.
And you can come to the book club even if you haven't read the book and just listen to the discussion. And I also just want to remind everyone that we do have this organization locally, Westside Interfaith Neighbors, and we have some events coming up, so just keep an ear out. We will be announcing those at church and also in our Thursday newsletters at times, and it's a wonderful group. We've got mosques, we've got a Hindu temple, we've got a Baha'i group, we've got LDS group. In fact, our next big event is going to be held at an LDS state house. So it's really trying to bring together all these diverse perspectives. So if you get a chance, try one of those events out because they're really fun. And thank you.